want you to picture a room full of grief. Not the loud kind, not the kind where people fall apart in the aisle or have to be held up by two people on either side. I mean the quiet kind. The kind where everyone is dressed in black and standing very still, and the air smells like lilies and old carpet and something underneath both of those things that you try not to think about. That is where this starts. Where are you watching from, and are you watching alone? Subscribe and stay. I have been to a lot of funerals in my life. Too many for my age, honestly. When you grow up in a big extended family with a lot of old people who start dying close together, funerals become almost routine. You learn where to stand, you learn what to say, and more importantly, what not to say. Geest, you learn how to read a room full of strangers who are all united by one shared loss, and how to tell which ones are struggling and which ones have already made peace with it. What I never learned was how to tell when someone in that room did not belong there at all. My great uncle Marlowe passed on a Tuesday in late October. He was 81 years old and he had been sick for a long time. So the grief in the room at his funeral was more of a settled, dignified kind. People cried, but softly. The service was held at a funeral home I had never been to before, a small place off a county road about 40 minutes from where I grew up. Dark wood paneling, burgundy carpet, rows of padded folding chairs facing a podium and a closed casket draped in flowers. I arrived early because my mother had asked me to help set up the printed programs on each chair. I was doing exactly that when I first noticed him. He was already seated in the back row when I came in, which was strange because the doors had only just been unlocked. He was a large man, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his 50s, I would guess, with close-cropped gray hair and a dark suit that fit him well. He sat with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes forward, and he did not acknowledge me when I walked past him. I assumed he was a colleague of my uncle's, or maybe a neighbor. I did not ask. You do not ask at funerals. People began to filter in over the next half hour. I greeted cousins I had not seen in years, accepted hugs from women who smelled like powder and hairspray, watched the room slowly fill from the front backward, when the large man in the back row did not move. He did not greet anyone. No one greeted him. He just sat there with his hands folded, watching the room fill, and every time I glanced back at him, he was looking at a different person, scanning almost, like he was taking inventory. My cousin Petra leaned over to me about 20 minutes into the service and whispered that she did not recognize the man in the back. I told her he was probably someone from Uncle Marlowe's work. She nodded and looked back at the pastor and seemed satisfied with that, but I was not. Because I just remembered something. Uncle Marlowe had been retired for over 15 years. He had not worked with anyone in a very long time. I turned around slowly, trying to be subtle about it, and looked at the man again. He was looking directly at me. Not in the way you look at someone when you accidentally make eye contact. He was looking at me the way you look at something you have been looking at for a while. Deliberate. Steady. And when our eyes met, he did not look away. He held it. 3 full seconds, 4, 5. And then he gave me the smallest possible nod, like we knew each other, like we had some kind of agreement, and looked back toward the front of the room. I turned back around and sat very still for the rest of the service. Afterward, during the reception in the adjacent room, I watched him without letting him see me watching. He moved through the space slowly and with complete confidence. He helped himself to coffee. He accepted a small paper plate of food from the table near the window. And he spoke to people. That was the part that bothered me the most. Artsy, he moved from cluster to cluster of mourners, engaging each group for just a minute or two, always nodding, always composed, and then moving on. And the thing was, people talked to him back. Nobody challenged him. Nobody asked who he was. Grief makes people assume. It makes them accept. You see a man in a dark suit at a funeral behaving like he belongs, and your brain fills in the rest. I pulled my Aunt Dorianne aside near the coffee table and described him quietly and asked if she knew who he was. She frowned and looked across the room at him. She watched him for a moment. Then she said very carefully that she had no idea. She said she had been watching him too, and had assumed he was one of Marlowe's old bowling league friends. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. She said she had introduced herself to him earlier, right after the service. She said she had told him who she was and that she was Marlowe's wife. And she said that he had taken her hand, held it in both of his, looked her directly in the eyes, and told her that Marlowe had been a wonderful man, and that he would be deeply missed by everyone who loved him. I asked her what his name was. She said she did not know. She said she had been so overwhelmed by grief in that moment that she had not thought to ask. I started moving through the room then, deliberately trying to find him again. I needed to just ask him. Directly, that was all. Just ask him his name and how he knew Marlowe. Simple, normal, something anyone could do. But I could not find him. I checked the main room. I checked near the casket. I walked back out to the reception area around the perimeter, eased past every cluster of black-dressed relatives. I stepped into the hallway and looked both directions. The man with the gray hair and the folded hands and the steady, deliberate gaze was gone. I found the funeral director near the back corridor and described the man to him. I asked if he had seen who I was talking about. The director frowned slowly. He said that the building had only one public entrance, which was staffed from the time the doors opened until well after the service ended. He said he had been near that entrance himself for most of the morning. He said that in 32 years of running that funeral home, he had never once seen a stranger come to a service, stay for the reception, speak to the family, and leave without anyone knowing who they were. He said it happened occasionally that someone got the wrong room or the wrong day, wandered in briefly, and left quietly once they realized their mistake. He said those people never stayed. He said those people never introduced themselves to the widow. I drove home that afternoon with the windows down, even though it was cold, because I needed the air. I kept turning that man's face over in my mind. The way he had scanned the room when he first came in, the way he held my aunt's hand, the way he had looked at me across all those rows of chairs and nodded slowly like we shared something I was not yet aware of. I still do not know who he was. I have asked every person who was in that room. Not one of them knew him. Not one of them remembered introducing themselves to him or being approached by him except my Aunt Dorianne, a teacher who cried when I brought it up again a week later and asked me please to stop asking about it because it made her feel like something had been taken from that day. Something had. I just do not know what. And I am aware, every time I think about it, that he had my name because my aunt introduced herself to him. And my aunt knows my name, and he was working that room very carefully, talking to everyone. I am aware of that. I think about it when my phone rings from a number I do not recognize. I think about it when someone I cannot quite place waves at me in a parking lot. I think about it more than I should. And I have never been to another funeral without standing with my back to a wall. There There's something nobody tells you about working at a funeral home. They tell you about the smell eventually, or they warn you that you will get used to it faster than you expect, which is somehow worse than being warned about it directly. They tell you about the hours and the families and the paperwork and the fact that grief looks different in every single person, and you will learn over time not to be surprised by any of it. What they do not tell you is that the building has its own rhythms, that you start to know instinctively when something is off. I had been working at the home for about 2 years when the Varston family came in to make arrangements. The deceased was a woman in her mid-60s. Her name was on the paperwork. The family consisted of her daughter, a quiet woman named Felice, who seemed to be somewhere in her late 30s, and a man who was introduced to me as the woman's son-in-law, whose name was Corden. He did the talking, almost all of it. Felice sat beside him with her hands clasped in her lap and said almost nothing, and whenever my colleague or I directed a question toward her, Corden answered it first. I noticed that, but grief works differently in different people, and I had learned not to read too much into body language during arrangements. Some people go quiet, some people go cold, some people let someone else take over entirely because it is the only way they can get through the room. I noticed other things over the following days as the service was prepared. Corden called the home several times to confirm details. He was precise and organized and had a list of specifications that was longer and more detailed than most families brought in. He wanted to know the exact positioning of the casket relative to the door. Whereas he wanted to know where the family would be seated and where general attendees would enter and exit. He asked twice whether there was a secondary entrance to the building that the public would not typically use. I told him that yes, there was a staff entrance at the rear, and that it was used exclusively by employees. He thanked me and did not ask any more about it. But I thought about that question afterward, in the quiet of the prep room. I thought about why someone planning a funeral would need to know about secondary exits. The service was held on a Thursday afternoon. The room filled to about half capacity, which was typical for a midweek service. Felice sat in the front row with 2 women I assumed were sisters or cousins, all 3 of them red-eyed and still. Corden sat at the end of the row, nearest the aisle. And throughout the service I noticed that he did not look at the casket once. Not during the eulogy, not during the readings. He faced forward technically, but his eyes moved. They moved to the door at the back of the room every few minutes, steady and regular, like a man watching a clock. The service ran about 45 minutes. Afterward, as people began to mill around and the family received condolences, I positioned myself near the arrangement table in the side alcove the way I always did during receptions. From there, I had a clear sight line to most of the room. A man came in about 10 minutes into the reception. He was older, 70s maybe, and he moved slowly, with the deliberate care of someone whose joints gave him trouble. He was alone. He wore a dark coat and carried his hat in both hands in front of him, and I knew the way older men do at formal occasions. He stood near the door for a moment, looking around the room, and then he began to make his way toward the front, toward Felice. I watched Corden see him. The change was immediate and total. Every casual quality drained out of him in under a second. His shoulders pulled in, his jaw set. He was on his feet before the old man had made it halfway down the aisle, and he moved to intercept him in a way that looked almost choreographed, like he had been waiting for exactly this to happen. I could not hear the exchange. I was too far away and the room noise covered it, but I could see it clearly. Corden placed himself directly in the old man's path. He spoke quietly and close, leaning in just slightly, and whatever he said caused the old man to stop walking. The old man looked past Corden toward Felice. Felice had not seen any of this yet. She was speaking with someone near the casket, her back to the aisle. The old man said something back to Corden. Corden's response was brief. One sentence, maybe two. And then something happened that I have thought about almost every day since. The old man looked at Corden for a long moment. Then he looked down at the hat in his hands. Then he turned around and walked back out the door. That was it. He just left. I moved through the room and out into the foyer as quickly as I could without drawing attention. The foyer was empty. I pushed through the front door to the parking lot and looked both directions. The old man was already in a car, a faded blue sedan near the far edge of the lot, and he was just sitting there, not starting the engine, just sitting. I stood on the steps and watched him for a minute. Then the car started slowly, and he pulled out and drove away. Back inside, I found my supervisor in the corridor and told him what I'd seen. He listened carefully the way he always did, and then he asked me a question I was not expecting. He asked whether Felice had seen any of it. I said I did not think so. He nodded and said nothing more, which was its own kind of answer. After the service, after everyone had gone, and we were quietly restoring the room, I found something on the floor near the back row, where the old man had been standing before Corden stopped him. It was a small envelope, unsealed, and it had clearly been dropped rather than left intentionally. Inside was a single folded piece of paper. I should not have read it. That was not my place, and I knew it. I read it. It was a short letter, handwritten in careful but slightly shaking script. It was addressed to Felice by name. It said that the writer needed her to know something about her husband that her mother had known and had been trying to tell her for the past several months. It said that her mother had called him in a state of fear twice in the weeks before she became ill. It said that she hadn't died the way the family had been told. It said that Felice needed to get out of that house. I stood there in that quiet room with that letter in my hand, and I thought about Corden's eyes moving to the door every few minutes during the service. I thought about him asking where the secondary entrance was. I thought about the way he had moved the moment he saw that old man walk in, fast and certain, like a man executing something he had already planned. And I stood in that room for a long time. The letter was barely half a page. Handwritten, as I said, in the careful looping script of someone old enough that penmanship still meant something. The paper was thin and slightly creased from being folded and unfolded, which told me it had been carried around for a while, prepared and reconsidered, and prepared again. This was not something the old man had written in the car on the way over. He had been holding this for days, maybe longer. He had come to that funeral knowing he might be the only person alive who could put it into Felice's hands. And Corden had walked him out in 40 seconds flat. The more I thought about the mechanics of that, the worse it felt. Corden had not been surprised to see him. That was the thing I kept circling back to. He had been watching the door the entire service. He had the room configured in a way that gave him the maximum possible angle of visibility. He knew who he was watching for, at least in enough detail to recognize the threat the moment it walked in. He had probably already decided what he was going to say. The whole interception was calm and efficient in the way that only rehearsed things are calm and efficient. How many times had he done something like that before? I told my supervisor he called someone. I do not know exactly who or exactly what was said because I was kept away from that part of it. I was asked to write down everything I had observed in order with timestamps where I could estimate them, and I did. I spent an hour at the desk in the back office, writing in the careful, neutral language I had been trained to use in documentation, and then trying to put observable facts on paper and leave interpretation out of it. It was the hardest piece of writing I've ever done because every observable fact I wrote down pulled something dark behind it. Corden arrived with the family at 2:14. Corden was seated at the end of the row nearest the aisle. Corden's eyes returned to the entrance at irregular intervals throughout the service. Corden rose from his seat and intersected with an unknown elderly male attendee at approximately 3:11. The exchange lasted under 2 minutes. The elderly male exited the building. Corden returned to his seat. Written out like that, in that language, it looked like almost nothing. A family member managing an unexpected arrival, a brief, quiet interaction, completely within the range of normal. That was the thing about it. Every single piece of it, viewed individually, was within the range of normal. I do not know what happened to Felice. I was told weeks later by someone who should not have told me that there had been an investigation. I was not told what the investigation found. I was not told what happened to Corden. When I asked again a few months after that, I was told only that the matter was being handled through appropriate channels and that my documentation had been useful. Useful. That word sat in me like a stone. I've wondered many times whether useful meant something happened in time, or whether useful meant that whatever came next at least had a paper trail. Those are very different things, and I have never been able to find out which one it was. I kept that job for another 4 months, and then I left. Not because of what happened, or not only because of what happened. Mostly because I stopped being able to walk into that building without thinking about the old man sitting in his car in the parking lot. Not leaving. Just sitting there with his hands probably still folded the way they were when I first saw him, staring at the building he had just been walked out of, holding the weight of what he had not been able to deliver, not knowing that the letter he had come to deliver was lying on the floor inside, face down on the dark burgundy carpet, in a room that was already being quietly straightened, while the man he had been trying to warn someone about drove away clean. I think about Felice. I think about her sitting in the front row with her 2 relatives, red-eyed. It's as completely unaware that 20 feet behind her something had happened that might have changed everything. I think about the fact that she never looked back, that she was too deep in her own grief to turn around. I hope someone got to her in time. I have never been able to confirm that they did. And that uncertainty is its own kind of haunting, the kind that does not make noise but never fully goes away. The last story I'm going to tell you is the one I have told the fewest people. Not because I do not think people would believe me. Enough time has passed, and enough of the details have settled into a shape that I could probably explain it in a way that made sense. The reason I have not told many people is simpler than that. Every time I tell it, I have to think about the drive home. And the drive home is the part I am not fully over yet. This was about 3 years ago. I was attending the funeral of a former co-worker named Tessa Grau. She was 44 years old, and she died in a car accident and the loss of her hit the group of us who had worked with her in the particular sharp and disorienting way that unexpected deaths hit you when you are not old enough yet to have fully accepted that people your age can simply stop existing without warning. The service was held in a small chapel attached to a cemetery about 25 miles from where I live now. It was a Saturday. Cold, overcast, the kind of day that feels appropriate for grief in a way that almost seems curated. I drove alone. I arrived, signed the book near the door, found a seat in the middle section, and spent the service thinking about Tessa and trying not to let the people around me see me cry. There was a woman sitting 2 rows ahead of me in one seat to the left. I noticed her because she did not cry. Not once. That in itself was not remarkable. As I said, grief is different in everyone, and its absence does not mean anything on its own. What I noticed more specifically was that she did not react to anything. Not the music, not the eulogy, which was given by Tessa's older brother and which was deeply personal and specific in the way the best eulogies are, full of real details about who Tessa actually was. The people around me dabbed their eyes or shifted in their seats or exhaled in that controlled way people do when they are holding something back. This woman did not move, or as she sat with perfect stillness and looked at the podium, and her face was completely neutral. I might have looked away and forgotten about her entirely, except that during the final piece of music, she turned her head and looked directly at me. Not toward me, not in the general direction of the row behind her, at me specifically, with the kind of focus that can only come from already knowing exactly where to look. Like she had known for some time that I was behind her and had simply chosen that moment to confirm it. She held the look for a moment, unsmiling, and then turned back to the front. I felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Afterward, at the graveside, I kept her in my peripheral vision. She stood slightly apart from the main cluster of mourners, which is common. But she was angled in a way that I kept noticing. Her body was facing the grave, but her eyes were not. She was watching the people. Specifically, I began to realize she was watching Tessa's family, moving from face to face with the same quiet intensity I had felt from her in the chapel. Someone from my old office touched my arm, and I turned to talk to them for a few minutes, and when I looked back, she was gone. After the graveside service ended, a small group of us walked back through the cemetery, toward the parking lot together, the way you do. We were talking quietly, sharing memories of Tessa, and I was only half present because part of my attention was still on the woman and the way she had looked at me. The parking lot was mostly emptied out by the time we reached it. I said my goodbyes to the others. I found my car near the back of the lot, got in, and sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel. The woman was parked 2 spaces to my left. She was already in her car, engine running, and she was facing forward. She did not look at me when I got in. She just sat there with the engine running while the lot continued to empty around her. I backed out and drove toward the exit. In my rear view mirror, I watched her car stay still. I pulled out onto the main road and drove. The cemetery road connected to a rural county road that ran straight for several miles before joining the highway. I had driven it on the way in, and it was deserted in both directions. Mostly farmland and tree lines and the occasional gravel driveway. About 2 miles from the cemetery, I noticed headlights behind me. Need I notice them the way you notice most things on a rural road in the middle of the afternoon, which is to say briefly and without concern. I adjusted my mirror out of reflex and kept driving. A mile further, the headlights were still there. Same distance, same pace. I told myself it was nothing. Same road, same direction, someone else who had been at the service or nearby. Rural roads, funnel traffic. This was nothing. I took the ramp onto the highway. The headlights followed. I want to be careful here about the difference between coincidence and pattern, because I am a reasonable person and I know that highways are shared and that someone driving the same general direction as me means nothing by itself. Hey, and I stayed in the right lane and set my speed on cruise control. And I watched the mirror with a frequency that was becoming less casual and more deliberate. The car stayed with me, not close enough to be aggressive, not so far back that I could tell myself it was a different vehicle than the one from the cemetery. Just there, steady, present. I passed my usual exit. I do not fully know why I did it. I did not make a conscious decision. I simply watched the exit approach and then watched it pass, and I kept driving, and I told myself I would get off at the next one and double back, that it would be fine, that I was being paranoid, and this whole line of thinking was born from a difficult afternoon and too much time spent staring at a strange woman in a chapel. In my mirror, the car changed lanes. It moved to the right lane, my lane. And it closed the distance between us, not fast, not aggressively, just a steady, deliberate reduction, like someone adjusting. I put my foot down and moved left and accelerated. The car behind me accelerated. I took the next exit at a speed I was not comfortable with and ran a light at the bottom of the ramp and turned right, and then immediately left into the parking lot of a large grocery store and pulled into a space between two other cars and killed my lights. I sat there with my hands shaking on the wheel and my eyes on the lot entrance. A car came off the ramp 20 seconds after I did. It drove past the lot entrance slowly. I could see the shape of it through the store windows, distorted by the glass, moving at the speed of something that was looking. It kept going. I sat in that parking lot for 45 minutes. I called a friend and talked about nothing and watched the entrance the entire time without telling them why I was calling or what had happened. Eventually, I drove home a different way, a longer way, checking my mirrors every 30 seconds for the full 40 minutes it took me. Nobody followed me. I got home and locked my door and sat on my couch and tried to be rational about it. The woman might not have even been from the funeral. The car behind me might have been a complete coincidence. I might have built an entire threat out of a few glances and some shared road. Might have. But here is the thing I keep coming back to, the thing that will not flatten into coincidence no matter how many times I try to press it there. When I signed the guest book at the chapel, I printed my first name and my last name clearly. Ace, because that is what you do. 3 days after the funeral, I received a text message from a number I did not recognize. It said only this. It said, "I saw you there." I did not respond. I blocked the number. I called the phone carrier and they told me the number had already been deactivated by the time I reported it. Tessa's family never found out who that woman was. I described her to Tessa's brother carefully a few weeks later when things had settled enough for that kind of conversation. He listened and then was quiet for a long time. Then he said that Tessa had told him about a month before the accident that she thought someone had been following her, that she had noticed the same car parked outside different places she went over the course of about 2 weeks. You'd see that she had mentioned it and then dropped it and told him she was probably just being paranoid. He said Tessa had never found out who it was either. He said the accident was ruled an accident. He said it without emphasis or inflection. and then changed the subject, and we never talked about it again. I have thought about that text message more times than I can count. I have thought about the way she already knew where I was sitting. I have thought about Tessa telling her brother she was being followed and then dying in a car accident a month later. I have thought about what it means that whoever sent that message wanted me to know they had seen me, not to threaten me, not to ask for anything, just to let me know. That is the part that has never settled, because a threat gives you something to respond to. A warning gives you something to act on. But someone who just wants you to know they were there watching and who disappears immediately after telling you leaves you with nothing except the awareness that you were seen. And the question of why that was worth telling you, I still do not have an answer to that. I am not sure I want one.
Thank you for watching. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe for more stories.